Don't you know anything? Long necks don't talk to, or whatever you are.
Me? I'm a long neck too, see? And I have a long tail like you. All right. I'm not a long neck, I'm a big one. But I am all alone, I am. I lost my family in the big earth shake.
If you haven't seen The Land Before Time, I highly recommend it to you, your kids, your friends, and everybody. It's an animated film that came out in 1988, released by Universal Pictures, and directed and produced by the legendary Don Bluth. It's a film that centers around friendships developed by Littlefoot, a male apatosaurus, and the primary protagonist of the film. This movie was such a pivotal film for me growing up, and I absolutely loved it.
So this film has a lot of deep themes that we'd think kids usually aren't ready for, dealing with loss. But that's a natural part of life, and we need to keep in mind that kids are dealing with the same things that we're dealing with, and we need to be ready to have these conversations with them. Now, what a lot of people don't know about this movie is there's a very dark history attached to it, one that a lot of people don't talk about, and we think it's worth bringing your attention to. The voice actress and child star who played Ducky in the film was murdered by her father before the film was ever released. Judith Barsi was only 10 years old. Welcome to No Streetlights Podcast. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Tim. Today we'll be taking a journey into a tale that is as heartbreaking as it is believable. It's a story that compels us to confront some dark truths about mental illness and the devastating impacts of abuse and what can happen if we don't intervene. We do dedicate this episode to Judith Barsi, the voice actress and child star who played Ducky in A Land Before Time, as well as Anne-Marie in All Dogs Go to Heaven. Both of these animated films were pivotal to me growing up, and I'm sure a lot of the viewers and listeners feel the same way. Behind the scenes though, Judith's life was completely different than these idyllic characters she portrayed. Her story is one of unimaginable pain and abuse, but through that we can glean some profound lessons about mental health and the importance of recognizing the signs of abuse. Judith Ava Barsi was born on June 6, 1978 in Los Angeles, California, and she died on July 25th, 1988. As Aaron already said, she was only 10 when she was unfortunately and sadly murdered by one of the people who should have been protecting her, and that was her father. Her father's name was Joseph Barsi, and he was an immigrant from Hungary. He moved to America during a tumultuous period, and he took a lot of the trauma that he had with him during his time growing up in his early years, and he brought it with him, sadly.
So whenever we were planning this episode, I had to do a lot of research into the Hungarian Revolution that kind of spawned this whole story, because I knew nothing about it. A bunch of students at the University of Budapest were protesting having foreign troops on their soil. They wanted freedom. They wanted to be able to express themselves. They were asking for free elections and freedom of speech, things that we take for granted here in the States quite often. And the scars of war run deep. During this tragic occurrence, over 3,000 people were killed, and 200,000 people were forced to flee their home, or after being arrested and prosecuted, they were exiled. So they had to deal with all the things that immigrants have to deal with. Language barriers, stereotypes, economic hardships, things that most of us can't imagine. It's hard enough to move from Virginia Beach to Coolville, Ohio, as I recently have done. I can't imagine seeing my friends blown apart by Soviet tanks and having to just come here and have a normal life. How does that even work?
Honestly, I can't imagine it either. And just the thought of having to move from halfway around the world to the other half, minus all that other stuff, terrifies me. So I can only imagine what a lot of the immigrants who had to flee Hungary were going through. In a strange twist of, I would call it good fortune for Joseph, he actually met his wife, Maria, after he immigrated to the States. Maria was another one of the refugees who had to flee. She was previously known as, I'm going to butcher this, but it was Maria Virovax. If I'm saying that wrong, I apologize greatly. But they did meet while she was working at a restaurant in California.
Now, Maria was a dedicated mother to Judith. She absolutely adored her little girl, who she just knew had it in her to become an actress. Maria really pushed Judith to carry herself with poise, and she was subsequently discovered at an ice skating rink by the scout Ruth Hansen. Ruth Hansen actually mistook her for being 3 years old at the time, which is pretty crazy. But yeah, I just can't imagine how much Maria loved her little girl.
Judith was their only child, and I think Maria putting so much time in nurturing Judith's talents and focusing on her future and career as an actress might have been one of the driving forces that led Joseph down such a dark path. He started showing signs of jealousy and resentment towards his daughter's growing success. And unfortunately, these things were exacerbated by his issues with alcoholism and his trauma from his past.
Yeah, Joseph actually had copped 3 charges for drunk driving. As we get later into the story, he would come home drunk instead of going to work and keep Maria and Judith from making their obligations. And I can't imagine having to live and deal with that much hate inside your heart that you have to engage in these externalizing behaviors.
Yeah, it's really sad. And to think about it too, we already said it, but Joseph was one of the people that Judith should have looked to as one of her main protectors in her life. But he would abuse her and emotionally and physically just torment her in a way. And Maria as well. She unfortunately was a victim of this as well. And it's really sad whenever you think about it. I mean, Judith had a very meteoric rise to fame. You know, after Ruth Hansen had discovered her in that ice skating rink, she quickly started placing her in commercials. Her first commercial ever was actually Donald Duck orange juice, which I vaguely recall from my childhood. So that's kind of crazy for me to think about. But yeah, I mean, she immediately went from doing commercials to television. In fact, it's reported that she actually was in over 50 to almost 100 commercials.
Yeah, the number we came up with was 70, but then we had some ambiguous, conflicting reports, so we just ballparked it at 50 to 100. But once she made the progression from commercials to television, she starred in family favorite sitcoms like Cheers.
And she was also in The Twilight Zone.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, I love that show so much.
So shortly thereafter, with Ruth Hansen's guidance, and really this highlights the importance of having mentors, she went from these commercials to television and then on to films to voice these beloved characters that you and I grew up with. I remember Ducky. She just was so warm, and I don't know, there was something about the naivete behind the voice. And then Anne Marie from All Dogs Go to Heaven. I must have watched that film a dozen times, and it was just so much fun.
Oh, yeah. Like, it's so crazy to think, too, because I remember when I first heard about this story, it's probably been a couple years now, but I remember, like, I didn't break down in tears, but I had this profound level of sadness just waft over me because I loved The Land Before Time growing up. That was one of my big movies, that, The Brave Little Toaster. Like, and Scooby-Doo was on that list as well, but I remember Ducky, and I was just like, I couldn't believe it. It's so sad that such an awful tragedy occurred to such a young soul and somebody with so much talent. And her life, she had to deal with so much pain that a lot of us probably can't even fathom. She was able to bring about like this unique and warmth, innocence to her voice. And I think that's kind of what made these characters stand out so much.
Yeah. It's a real travesty that as we learned more about this story, we actually uncovered that Judith was supposed to sing Soon You'll Come Home and All Dogs Go to Heaven, but they had to hire someone to sing it for her because of all the trauma she was facing. She would always break down in tears before the end of the song. And since she was murdered before the film was finished, the theme song for this movie, Love Survives, was dedicated to her. And, you know, we're very lucky to be partnering with some artists who are going to bring their own renditions of these songs to us because they're so deeply impacted by this story.
And we're really excited to share these projects with you. And, you know, it's a great way to kind of honor Judith's memory and looking back on how much we have changed in the past now almost 40 years since this tragedy occurred. You know, and the worst part about all this, I think, is that there were signs, but there was such little, like, roadblocks put or, you know, checks and balances implemented for child actors and people in general. You know, domestic violence wasn't even viewed as like a major issue. It was viewed as more of a family-based problem. So you could call the cops for a domestic violence situation and they would just show up and be like, well, there's no bruises, and then they would leave. Which, in fact, that happened to Maria. She tried to report that Joseph was abusing her and Judith. And when the police showed up, they didn't do anything about it.
Yeah, we've heard the story so many times. Even whenever cops would show up back in the 70s and 80s, if you just told them that you were putting somebody in their place, they were like, hell yeah, brother, you get them. Which is absolute bullshit. You know, we talk all the time about how we're trying to change as a society towards kindness and understanding, loving and understanding our role in protecting each other. If someone comes to you, like Maria did to her family, and talks about how she needed to get out, she was terrified of her husband. He had threatened to kill her and her daughter several times, but she just felt trapped. And luckily, during our research, we found that the Violence Against Women Act passed in 1994 with broad sweeping reforms to the criminal justice system. And as Tim stated, young performers on set need to be protected. So background checks started being implemented for directors and producers. But how many documentaries have we seen on Netflix about how that hasn't changed anything? There are still predators in the costuming department, and the best boy grip doing a little too much gripping. We have to protect those around us. We really do. And we do that by having these hard conversations.
I think understanding exactly what could have led to this, and we're probably going to be speculating a little bit here because Joseph, I mean, we can't diagnose him posthumously, so we have to take a look and consider most likely what he suffered from, and depression, anxiety, personality disorders. You know, these conditions, if they're left untreated, they can significantly impair judgment and impulse control. That, and also the presence of alcohol and substance abuse, I mean, that's a building storm. And unfortunately, all the trauma that Joseph had faced during his earlier years and just never being able to come to terms with those things, that snowballed into a problem for Maria and Judith. It became this horrible living environment to the point where they had to walk around eggshells. I mean, I can't imagine what it must have been like for Judith thinking that she's not only being scrutinized by the public eye now because she's in TV and movies, but she goes home and she's abused by her father. And you know, everything that we've read so far shows that Maria had tried. She really tried to create this better environment for Judith. And she had so many hopes and dreams that they would have like a happy home and a happy life. But Joseph did everything in his power to make sure that that would never be a reality for them.
Yeah, we say quite often here on this show that all feelings are welcome, but all behaviors are not. Our role in the lives of others is to protect and provide the support they need. We have to protect them and help them grow through what they're going through. So here soon we're going to have an icon out in the UK come on our show and talk to us about PTSD. And Tim and I both have mental health struggles. Almost everyone in my life has been diagnosed with something. And the presence of a mental health condition doesn't mean that you're a time bomb. It's when you don't deal with your stuff. All of our feelings are our responsibility. And instead of dealing with all these feelings and potentially PTSD and personality disorders, Joseph chose to try and control everything around him, which isn't feasible. The only thing we can affect is ourselves.
The abuse had gotten so bad that at one point, Joseph literally walked into Judith's room while she was packing to get ready to go film Jaws 4. I think it was filmed in the Bahamas, if I remember correctly, but Joseph went up to her and put a kitchen knife to her neck, saying that he was literally going to slit her throat if she didn't come back from filming. Like, I can't even imagine what it must be like. I couldn't imagine dealing with that as a 31-year-old male if somebody did that to me. But being a probably 8 or 9-year-old child at the time when Judith had to face this, I can only imagine. I mean, it makes sense that people noticed the significant stress and behavioral changes around her. You know, a lot of the industry professionals and Ruth herself had even noted that Judith was becoming late, like showing up late to her appointments, breaking down in tears during auditions. And it just makes me wonder, like, how come nobody was able to step up and do anything at that time?
And that's the sad reality of living with abuse. They're not always abusive. It's not always awful, because then you would have to leave. Typically there's a cycle. And I'm not a psychologist. I can't go into this too deeply. I've just watched a lot of talks on it recently in order to be able to speak competently in this episode. But after a huge event like that, there's kind of this honeymoon phase where they kind of reassure you that that's not who they are. It's not going to happen again. And you really have to just take note of what's actually happening. Yes, maybe he did take her to the ice skating rink, but that doesn't make what he did before okay. And luckily now there are tons of support groups, victim advocacy, and homes that you can go to if you're not feeling safe. But as we said, back then it was seen as a family issue, and if you can't make it work, you're kind of a failure. And thankfully we're moving away from that. And to touch on what you were talking about, living with that kind of abuse, you do kind of dissociate, and then you get these delusions that maybe you're doing something wrong, maybe it's your fault, and if you're better, then the abuse won't continue. And yes, people around her saw that she was so stressed she was even pulling out her eyelashes and having unnatural weight fluctuations for a child her age.
It's insane. But at one point, some neighbors had even noted that actually Joseph had said something to the effects of like, children don't respect what you do for them these days or something, involving a toy. Like Judith had left a toy in the middle of the lawn. And Joseph said that to the neighbors. The neighbors watched Joseph go over, grab the toy, and smash it. Like, that's so terrible. Like, what the hell?
Yeah. Now, this episode isn't just going to be us commiserating about how awful things are. We also, in order to honor Judith's legacy, we have to look to the future. We have to do better. So, as we stated, I mean, there are all these organizations out there nowadays, but we ourselves have to change. We have to love and support each other. We have to believe people when they're telling us that they're going through these things. And we have to let people know that it's absolutely unacceptable to act like this.
Yeah, 100%. If you find yourself in a situation where you're faced with domestic violence, or somebody that you know is faced with dealing with domestic violence, don't just brush it off and let that person become re-victimized. Try and find a way for intervention or support, or call the police. There are so many different resources available out there, and I really, really hope that people are aware of them so that this way we can avoid horrific situations like this in the future.
Yeah. Your story doesn't have to end like Maria and Judith did on July 28th, 1988, when their bodies were discovered in their home in San Fernando Valley. There is hope out there. There are people who want to help you. And, we always talk at the end of every episode how there are hotlines. You can call 911, you can call 988. I've seen incredible stories of people calling 911 and saying they need to order a pizza because there are abusers in the room. If you want help, you can put a dot on your palm when you go to work and someone will see it, and slip a note to a teller at a bank. All these reforms are for nothing if we're not here. You have to be cognizant. You have to be looking for all these signs and symptoms. And if you've suffered abuse, that trauma is going to be ongoing. It doesn't go away. We've talked about compartmentalization some, and that's a battlefield tactic. If you need to just take note of something and then push it to the side and go on with your business and get the job done, that's something that works for a moment. That is not a lifestyle. We have to address these things. And, we've partnered with BetterHelp, so if you need a therapist and there aren't resources in your area, you can use our code betterhelp.com/NSLP. It'll get you 10% off your first month. But really, we just want to see you get the help you need and deserve.
Definitely.
Your traumas don't go away. That stuff is going to lead, like, for me, I had a difficult time growing up, and that led to me not being able to securely attach to people. I always jumped around in relationships because I thought that's what love was, because I didn't have any stability.
I think you pointed out very importantly here, but looking towards the future, we have to remember that advocacy and education are key here. We've made so much progress over these past 40-ish years, and we have a strong foundation now, but there's still a lot of work to be done. One of the most important legacies from Judith's story here, as sad and dark as it is that her situation actually pushed for some increased awareness and reform around getting child actors actual psychological attention and letting them see mental health resources and providers. And Judith did actually receive psychological evaluations during her life, but unfortunately, they never took any actions to make sure she had a safe environment to return to. So it kept happening over and over.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about, in this episode, Joseph using alcohol. And we talked in Aaron's episode about how that can hide the problem. But for Joseph, it likely led him deeper and deeper into the hole, as with many of our guests and in our own life experience. So you can't run from your problems. You have to face them.
And the thing that makes me so angry, if I can go ahead and interrupt here, Aaron, but a lot of people might hear that Joseph was an alcoholic and they might immediately just blame, like, oh, well, it was the alcohol that caused this problem, which, don't get me wrong, it definitely was a contributing factor to Joseph's mental decline. But there's reports showing that Joseph had actually not been drinking for approximately 2 years before he actually murdered his family. And that just goes to show you, like, the damage had already been done. He didn't need that lack of inhibition. He already had it in his mind. He had the ability to do that. It was a ticking time bomb. It was going to happen because there was no help, there was no intervention, and nobody was able to see the signs, put it together, and be able to intervene. And it frustrates me so much because I know in 2024 we can look back on these things and say that wouldn't happen today. But it does still happen today. These things do still happen today. The abuse goes unreported. The alcohol intake increases more and more. And the next thing you know, you have to read another obituary. And I can only imagine how somebody like Ruth Hansen would have felt the day they learned of this, seeing the signs and thinking that they might be able to help and maybe even pushing Judith for psychological treatment. But it wasn't enough. And that must be something that weighs heavily. In fact, we talked about it a little bit, but in All Dogs Go to Heaven, during the scene where Charlie is saying goodbye to Anne Marie, the voice actor Burt Reynolds playing Charlie, it's reported that he had to do that scene over 60 times because he would just break down crying. Because unfortunately, Judith had already passed away at that point by the time he recorded his lines. And it was so difficult for him. And I can only imagine how difficult it must have been for everybody around them.
Like I said, the story doesn't have to end like this for you or for the next Judith and Maria. We have to build the life we deserve. We can't accept this kind of abuse. We have to get with our friends, Mr. Chaz, who teaches children about boundaries and communicating and dealing with their emotions. If, you're past that, you're in your 30s like me and Tim and all of our other listeners who are thinking about the Iron Giant and the Land Before Time and the Little Toaster. We have Melissa Height, who her first course she usually introduces people to is boundary work. Mm-hmm. We have Alexa Brimmer, who talks about feeling safe inside your body and how to express yourself that way. So you can build the life you deserve. There are resources and beautiful souls out there who are going to help you make it happen.
Yeah. I know the style of content is drastically different from what Aaron and I typically bring you over here on NSLP, but Judith's story, it really did resonate with us so much. And this isn't the only one that we've stumbled upon that we said, hey, maybe we should talk about this, because dealing with this domestic violence and PTSD and abuse, these are things that, need to be talked about. Aaron and I talk a lot about the human experience, and most of our episodes we feature a guest who likes to talk about how they've overcome their challenges. But unfortunately, not everybody is able to overcome those challenges. Sometimes they fall victim to them. And if we want to talk about the human experience, we have to talk about the good and the bad, no matter how depressing it is.
We would have loved to have had Judith on to talk about her experience and how she overcame it, but she's not here to do that. So Tim and I had to try and find a way to share her story in a meaningful way that's going to help people. So we'd really love to hear your feedback. We'd love to hear your experiences, either with these films or in your own life. How have you overcame these struggles? Are you still dealing with that? We just want to be here to help you heal. And if you're already in a place where you've done a lot of healing, we want to recognize that. We love you and we're proud of you for that.
Yeah. Aaron and I are not medical professionals, so what we say, it can't necessarily be taken as any kind of serious advice, but if you do need help, again, please reach out to those resources, 911, text or call 988, or take a look at betterhelp.com/NSLP or any other kind of, mental health resources available online if needed, if you can't find somebody in person to help you immediately. Again, whenever it comes to creating a show and talking about things like this, we do take the subject very serious, and we want to make sure that we're doing right by Judith. So I really hope that all of you have listened to this story and been able to kind of resonate with it the same way we did and feel that kind of anger and desire for reform and a better set of resources out there for everybody. Mental health is no joke. It's not fake. It is very real. And everybody deserves to be the better version of themselves that they see themselves as. So let's hope that people reach out, get resources, let us know what you think. And please share this episode with somebody who thought of it, and subscribe, leave a comment, anything that you can think of to let us know what you thought of this.
Tim and I are really trying to grow this platform so we can touch more hearts and minds, because with the 24-hour news cycle, you can't process your feelings and understand what's going on and think about how you want to affect change. But if the way you're affecting change is listening to your friends, that is going to be such a blessing to them, and it's going to set ripples further than you're ever going to see. We talked about how the scars of war run deep through generations, but the opposite is also true. If you're a loving, present person, you're going to change lives well after you're gone. So figure out how to get into your parasympathetic system. Deal with your stuff so you can be here for those around you and yourself. You deserve the love. That's why every episode, just like this, we say, be good to yourselves and each other. We do love you.
I think one of the saddest ways that we've ever had to end an episode is going to be on a very somber note here, but Judith and Maria, they are buried in Forest Lawn Memorial Park in adjoining plots. They aren't here with us today, clearly, and with that being said, we hope that they are resting peacefully without dealing with fear and manipulation and trauma caused by a chronic abuser. So, it's a very dark way to end a show where we talk about being your own light, but sometimes there's no streetlights. So, thank you for joining us.
Peace be with you.
All I have is a picture in my mind how it would be if we were together.
You want to go with me? Yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, yes. I do.